Several years ago, Kim Baker asked me to write a chapter on the history of the Illinois River for a book she was editing. I'd like to share the river's history with you by summarizing that chapter from the Illinois River Survey, a visual record, which was published in 2011. To keep my comments to a reasonable length, I've picked about a dozen passages and will bridge the gaps to provide a coherent account. Meandering through the flinty hills of the Ozark Plateau, the Illinois River and its tributaries not only carve the region's terrain, they also flow through its colorful past and influenced its modern development. Annually, an estimated 350,000 people paddle down the river's clear-flowing waters, camp and picnic along its banks, swim in its deep holes, and fish its entire length. Many return year after year, drawn not only by its recreational attractions, but equally by the natural beauty of its setting. The steep bluffs it carved, the forested valleys through which it meanders, and the breathtaking vistas it sculpted have inspired and defied photographers since the dawn of the camera. Images of its beauty have been recorded in photographic emulsion and more recently in digital format. But no single picture can capture the ever-changing panorama the river presents as it moves through the Ozarks. Photographs can also provide only occasional glimpses of the fascinating story of the men and women who lived in the Illinois Valley in Oklahoma and Arkansas. Human activity in the river's basin predated its history. Stone artifacts, remains of early Native Americans, and nearby mounds provide tantalizing clues about the Indians who occupied the valley for millennia before the arrival of the first Europeans. When the ancestors of the Indians moved into the Illinois Valley 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, the edge of a continental ice cap towered above the landscape less than 200 miles to the north. The moist climate accelerated the decay of organic material, leaving little indication of the humans who lived in the area and moved through it. As the glacier receded, the climate changed, but forests of oak and hickory continue to blanket the hills of the rugged Ozarks. Archaeologists, excavating what they call the Packard site, trenched 12 feet into the alluvial soil and documented a record of gradual cultural evolution. At the lowest level, fire pits, flint flakes, and charcoal provide a fleeting glimpse of a hunter-gatherer people who camped there 5,000 years before the Egyptians constructed their pyramids. From the first indications of the presence of human activity at that level, 9 feet of earth recorded the passage of 7,500 years and revealed artifacts that suggest little change in the roving routine of the area's native people. The 30 inches of soil nearest the surface provide evidence that the Native Americans had begun cultivating crops, hunting with bows and arrows, and fabricating pottery vessels. Woodland Indians of the Ozark became more sedentary, constructing villages near the farm fields they cultivated and erecting earthen mounds for ceremonial purposes, including the burial and cremation of their dead. Tools recovered from graves suggest the growing importance of cultivated crops, and anthropologists envision a division of labor in which women tilled the soil while men hunted and engaged in war. Over time, the art of these early Americans grew more elaborate, indicating a widespread commerce that brought them obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, and copper from the shores of Lake Superior. Illiterate trappers and traders of French ancestry may have been the first Europeans to penetrate the area that is now northeastern Oklahoma. The French built outposts in the Arkansas Valley, and early expeditions mapped the region and named many of its rivers, including the Sallisaw, Grand, Verdigris, and Illinois. The last of these streams probably reminded some early French trader from the north of a river he knew from his trading below Lake Michigan. That Illinois River was probably named for the Illini Indians who lived in the upper Mississippi River Valley. The identity of the Frenchman who actually named the river had probably been forgotten before his king, Louis XV, transferred title of the Louisiana country to Spain by the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762. The earliest official American explorer of northeastern Oklahoma, Lieutenant James Wilkinson, floated down the Arkansas River in late December of 1806 and noted in his journal that he had just passed the mouths of the River des Illinois, but offered no explanation of the origin of the river's name. I briefly discuss the retrocession of Louisiana by Spain to France, Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana, and the dispute between the Osages and Cherokees over the valley of the river. In 1817, at the Battle of Claremore Mound, the Cherokees killed about 80 Osages and took more than 100 captives. Most of the victims were women and children. The massacre didn't intimidate Osage warriors, and bloodshed continued for another decade with the Illinois River Basin as ground zero. When Harvard botanist Thomas Nuttall paddled up the Arkansas River in 1819, he commented on the brutality of the attack on the Osages and mentioned the difference between the clear Illinois and the muddy Arkansas, a contrast still obvious almost 2 centuries later. By 1828, most of the Osages had been persuaded to move into Kansas, and the western Cherokees traded land in Arkansas for territory in what is now northeastern Oklahoma. Within a year, the relocated western Cherokees established their seat of government near the mouth of the Illinois River. Named for Talonteski, who had led 300 Cherokees west in 1809, the tribal council ground served as the capital of the western branch of the tribe until 1839. Talonteski's brother, John Jolly, built a home nearby and served as chief of the western Cherokees. In 1829, Sam Houston resigned as governor of Tennessee and moved to Talonteski to live with the Cherokees. Jolly, who had taken Houston into his family 20 years earlier, hoped his politically astute adopted son could advise and assist the tribe in its dealings with President Andrew Jackson. Houston's fortunes were at a low ebb, however. He drank heavily while in Indian Territory. Once named the Raven by members of his adopted tribe, their frequently inebriated guest earned a new name, the Big Drunk. Today, the log buildings at Talonteski have been restored or reconstructed by the Oklahoma Tourism and Recreation Department. Located a little south of the original site, they house a museum focusing on the history of the Cherokees who migrated west before the Trail of Tears. At this point, I begin an historical expedition up the Illinois, discussing events that occurred along the river's banks. The trip begins at the abandoned site of the Kerr-McGee Corporation's Sequoia Fuels facility, which I discuss at some length. To save time, let me just say that 500,000 years from now, if you're still around and the river's still flowing, you could spend a few minutes where the corporation's raffinate pond was, and you'd never need a flashlight again, because you'd glow in the dark. Gore, just west of the mouth of the Illinois, is the first and perhaps oldest town in the valley of the river. Named for U.S. Senator Thomas P. Gore, the community is located on U.S. Highway 64. That route, which follows the old Whiskey Road from Fort Smith into Indian Territory, was used by early-day bootleggers who ignored laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol to Native Americans. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the fictional Joad family of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath crossed the Illinois River on US 64 at the beginning of its journey to California. On the way up the river, we pass land allotted to Cherokee medicine man Redbird Smith, who established the Nighthawk Cotuas to oppose allotment of Indian land. The Cotuas still have an annual stomp dance here on the weekend closest to Smith's birthday. Prehistoric Indians may have been drawn to this section of the Illinois Valley by the region's salt springs, which also attracted early white settlers. In 1817, the year Fort Smith was established, Mark and Richard Bean settled in the lower Illinois River Valley. In 1820, the Beans and their partner, Reuben Sanders, began operations on Salt Creek, about a mile from the Illinois and 4 miles north of Gore. It took about 3 days to boil away 55 gallons of water to make a bushel of salt. Communities as far away as Little Rock bought salt for about $1 a bushel from the Illinois River Works. An early pioneer who obtained salt from the works in the lower Illinois Valley was Levi Cookson, a shrewd businessman and prominent Cherokee Nation politician. The foothills of the Boston Mountains, where he made his home, would eventually bear his name. It's ironic that the hills, now famous as a haven for outlaws, were named for this hard-working, law-abiding pioneer. From the days of the Civil War, the Cookson Hills had provided shelter for guerrillas, outlaws, and moonshiners, and its reputation as an outlaw sanctuary persisted into the 20th century. In fact, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, and dozens of lesser-known criminals added a new chapter to the hill's notorious heritage. Moonshining and bootlegging remained one of the few profitable businesses in the area throughout the hard times of the 1930s. In fact, one moonshiner and his fiancée paid a justice of the peace 2 gallons of shine to marry them. Stills weren't the only thing nestled in the valley of the Cookson Hills. A 35-mile-long man-made reservoir follows the channel of the Illinois River and its tributaries. Named for a Cherokee Indian who operated a ferry on the river below the present dam site, Tenkiller Ferry Lake was completed in 1954 and has transformed this once secluded section of the Cookson Hills into a tourist mecca. The abundant water supply and the area's long growing season have also attracted commercial nurseries whose container-grown plants are distributed throughout the nation. Lake Tenkiller extends almost as far north as historic Park Hill. Paddling north up the Illinois, we pass historic Park Hill. Its printing press, female seminary, and homes of Cherokee leaders earned it a reputation as the Athens of Indian Territory. It also had a dark side. Elias Boudinot was stabbed to death here by Cherokees who opposed the removal treaty, and during the Civil War, Boudinot's brother, Stand Watie, burned John Ross's home, Rose Cottage, in retaliation. Across the river from Park Hill, the Barren Fork flows into the Illinois. This spring-fed stream is the longest tributary of the Illinois and a favorite for fishermen. The spelling of the creek's name is a matter of controversy, sometimes appearing as B-A-R-O-N. To discover the proper spelling, it's necessary to go back to 1841, when a severe summer drought dried up many of the springs that fed the creek. Until that time, the west-flowing tributary had been known as the Fork of the Illinois, but that year, with the entire channel barren of water, the people of the region began calling it the Barren, B-A-R-R-E-N, Fork. Even after the water returned, the name remained, if not always spelled to reflect its drought-induced origin. Continuing north, not far west of the river, the Cherokees established their new national capital in Tahlequah. 3 historic buildings remain from that period. The Supreme Court, completed in 1844, the National Capitol, finished in 1869, and the tribe's National Prison opened in 1875. Tahlequah was also the site of the killing of Dan Maples, a deputy U.S. Marshal, in the spring of 1887. He was shot on the south side of what is now the northeastern campus. Although conclusive evidence was never produced, Ned Christie was accused of the crime, adding another chapter to the saga of violence in the post-Civil War era of Cherokee history. Several hundred yards north of the place Dan Maples was gunned down, the Cherokees reconstructed their female seminary after the original school burned down on Easter Sunday, 1887. The new facility opened in 1889 on the northern edge of Tahlequah on May 7th. the day the original female seminary was dedicated in 1851. That day was celebrated by several generations of seminarians, both male and female, with picnics on the seminary ground or along the banks of the Illinois River. In 1909, 2 years after Oklahoma entered the Union, the new state purchased the female seminary building as a site for a state normal school, an institution to train teachers. Over the years, many seminary graduates and former students attended the normal school, sharing the building's legacy of education with non-Indian students. The normal school evolved into a state teachers college and eventually was designated as Northeastern State University. Although more than a century has elapsed since the closing of the Cherokee Female Seminary, May 7th is still observed on the Northeastern campus, and its 21st century students still find relief from the academic grind on the banks of the Illinois River, just like their counterparts in the Cherokee seminaries. Along the river, we've passed commercial nurseries and large climate-controlled metal buildings in which poultry and eggs are produced on a large scale for Hudson, Tyson, and other agribusinesses. The nutrient-rich runoff from these operations degrades the water quality of the river, but it's probably not as harmful as the treated effluent dumped into the Illinois by the towns and cities along its course. The next stretch of river is the most spectacular, in my opinion, with Goats Bluff towering some 80 feet above the stream near a country road that crosses Cedar Hollow, a distressed sandstone creek bed. The Illinois continues north past numerous canoe rental businesses. The most popular section of the river with floaters, the stretch from No Head Access Area to Chewy Bridge, traverses heavily forested hill country before turning east near the mouth of Flint Creek. An historic landmark stands on the creek's east bank a few miles above the Illinois. Hildebrand Mill, built in 1845, was washed away by a flood late in the 19th century. The original French grindstones were recovered and reinstalled when the mill was rebuilt in 1907. The mill's location on a major road into Indian Territory made it a prominent landmark for early travelers. Like most mills, it was also a meeting place for those who lived nearby. One meeting that occurred there had particularly bloody consequences. I mentioned Ezekiel Proctor's accidental shooting of Polly Beck Hildebrand. Proctor was actually trying to kill her husband. The episode led to the Going Snake Courthouse shootout, in which 11 men died, including a deputy U.S. Marshal. A few miles southeast of Hildebrand Mill, the clear waters of several small streams flowing through a rolling prairie plummet 77 feet into Dripping Springs, a deep, wooded hollow. The waterfall cascades past ferns, moss, and algae that flourish in the humid, dark chasm, and has attracted tourists for at least 2 centuries. The site was featured in the 1974 motion picture adaptation of Wilson Rawls' children's novel, Where the Red Fern Grows. In 1990, the state purchased the springs and the adjacent 120 acres and renamed it Natural Falls State Park because another state park near Okmulgee was already named Dripping Springs. The site has been ranked as one of the 10 most beautiful places to visit in Oklahoma. The river continues east past the site of Fort Wayne, an Army post built in 1839 and abandoned a few years later because of its unhealthy location. The river was dammed nearby in the 1920s, creating Lake Francis, which eventually became an algae-choked bog until a flood in the spring of 1990 washed away much of the dam. The Illinois traverses a country of flinty, forested hills and upland prairies, not unlike the landscape in parts of Italy. Late in the 19th century, a Catholic priest sent to investigate the conditions of Italians in America found one destitute group in the cotton country of southeastern Arkansas. He purchased 1,000 acres of rolling land above the Illinois River in northwest Arkansas and moved 35 of the impoverished Italian families there. They established Tontitown in 1897 and immediately began planting grapes. Today, few of the current generation speak Italian, but several restaurants and a grape festival each August are reminders of the community's origin. The largest and one of the oldest cities in the Illinois Valley, Fayetteville, was settled by pioneers in the late 1820s on the road between Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Springfield, Missouri. Its location on that important highway proved disastrous during the Civil War as Confederate and Union armies surged through the town, destroying many of its buildings. After the war, in 1871, the state established a college that became the University of Arkansas. From the mid-1870s, the twin towers of Old Main have dominated the campus and have served as a landmark for over 100 classes of graduating seniors. Moving south, we passed the site of the Battle of Prairie Grove, in which Confederate and Union soldiers fought and died on a battlefield divided by the Illinois River on December 7, 1862. South of the battlefield, the Illinois diminishes rapidly. At Hogeye, Arkansas, the last community along the Illinois, the river occasionally runs dry. Hogeye was never much of a village, but once it was a way station on the nation's first regular transcontinental mail route. In 1859, John Butterfield began twice weekly stagecoach service between Missouri and San Francisco. The route ran through northwest Arkansas and Hogeye, a relay stop where passengers could stretch their legs and purchase a bad meal or excellent corn whiskey. The relocation of the stage route in 1860 stopped Hogeye's growth. It still has only one store. Apparently the food hasn't improved much, but local lore suggests the quality of the moonshine hasn't declined. South of Hogeye, the old Butterfield route climbed into the Boston Mountains before crossing into the valley of the Arkansas. Although its course is different, the Illinois also climbs into the Boston Mountains, into a country as rugged but no longer as remote as it was in 1859. There, fed by springs, are the headwaters of the river, 170 miles from its mouth near Gore. In its passage through the Ozarks, the Illinois has carved a landscape of quiet beauty and serenity. For most of its past, the river flowed through a wilderness unoccupied by human beings. When Native Americans penetrated the river's valley, their impact was minimal for thousands of years. But as the human population of the Illinois River Valley increased, its effect on the river's fragile ecosystem multiplied. In the early 1980s, concerned by the approval of Fayetteville's plan to discharge treated sewage into the Illinois River Basin, citizens of the Tahlequah area formed Save the Illinois River Incorporated. The organization claims several judicial and legislative successes, but human pressure remains a growing threat to the river and the environment of the region. The challenge of a mushrooming population living harmoniously with nature isn't restricted to the Illinois River. It may be the most perplexing problem facing humanity in the 21st century, and the greatest challenge to maintaining the beauty captured by these images of the Illinois River.